the TEFL Commute, Season 6, Episode 5, Classic, in which Shaun and I discuss all the oldies and goodies in our profession. Hey, Shaun.
Hey, Lindsay. Oldies and goodies in our profession. That's us two, then, yeah.
Oldie. we are the classics of ELT. Yes, the oldies and goodies. I was trying to think in that introduction. Yeah, a classic. I guess a classic, like all the good old stuff. Books, activities, things that we would consider classics. Although before we get started, I guess I should probably do my shtick of like saying who we are and what this is about, right?
Go on, do it.
All right, so welcome everybody. If you're a first-time listener, you are listening to the TEFL Commute. I'm your host, Lindsay Clanfield. I'm joined by Shaun Wilden. We are both English teachers and teacher trainers, and we do this podcast, which is for English teachers, but it's not really about English language teaching, although the topic tends to come up. And it's probably going to come up today, right?
I was going to say, how do you avoid it coming up today? I like the fact that we've recorded 43 episodes of this, plus another whole series, plus another whole series of podcasts, and you got my name wrong. Brilliant.
All right. It's because I never hear your name. And Wilden. I
believe you actually called me Shan Wilden there, which is interesting.
I know, because I think as it was coming out of my mouth, I suddenly had like a little, I made the classic mistake of pausing. There you go. I'm see how I weave it back into the conversation.
It's not as bad. I could be called Ian.
I know, James, it's not as bad as that. This, by the way, is in reference to when I started doing this podcast 3 years ago. Our producer, James Taylor, I constantly referred to as Ian. And I have no idea why. And that wasn't even, I couldn't even write that off as badly pronounced. I think I'm just an oldie now, not a goodie even.
You're not an oldie, not a goodie, yeah. So classic. I found this very interesting because I thought when we were, as we do before each season, and we're kind of thinking about what we're going to talk about as the season unfolds, I thought this would be a fairly easy episode in terms of these must be classic. But the more I kind of was preparing, the more I started wondering what would be the parameters of a classic? Because if I think of literature, you've got Dickens, I guess we'd say it's a classic. Shakespeare is a classic. But ELT, I mean, my ELT, because of when I started work and how I am, is one thing. I don't know, classic methodology books or whatever. So I'll take, for example, I'll take as a Delta trainer and a Delta candidate many years ago, you're always told to read the classic Richards and Rogers, which approaches to methodology. Lindsay?
Yes. Okay, that's right. I would also consider that as a teacher trainer. And if you are somebody who has done a diploma or Delta or indeed an MA or graduate studies in English language teaching, I'm sure you would all agree that, like it or hate it, Richards and Rogers approaches and methods in language teaching, right?
That's right, yeah. On its fourth edition.
That would be considered a classic. I think it earns the title classic because it gets kind of referred to as just Richards and Rogers. Like, that's it. It's kind of got its own.
Yeah, everyone
knows what it is. We'll come to other books like that. By the way, let's just rewind a bit. We're starting obviously on books, but I want to touch in this episode on other things that could be considered classic in our field. So
I'm just intrigued by the kind of the way my mind works, and I think we'd agree. I mean, we think when we get to activities, we'll probably agree more. But I think it was because I went down the book route. I thought I just generally thought this would be easy, but then I started thinking, when does something become a classic, but I guess if you I like your definition of referring to it only by its author's name, so Richards and Rogers in that sense.
Yeah, or other things might become classic if they're referred to as like the red book, or the blue one or something like that. I'm not talking about a course book necessarily, but if everybody was referring to it by something other, like it's a kind of a commonly referred to name. I think I suppose it depends on people's how long you've been teaching, how long you've been around. Because I suppose some things are classic, and then other more things that we consider modern are classic. I often think of this like as a slight detour. I think of this with music when I hear, I still remember hearing someone say, "Oh yes, the album Nevermind by Nirvana is a classic," and I was like, no, because that's really like recent. And someone said, no, it's around 30 years old. And I'm like, really? I thought it was like, it feels like that was just yesterday. So I consider that to be maybe a modern classic. I would go as a stretch. I mean, I like rock music. So, but I suppose for someone who's 18 now or 19, that was like 20 years before they were born. So that is like the equivalent of whatever the big famous album would have been 20 years before we were born, like I don't know, an Elvis one, or even earlier than that. So maybe yeah,
fair enough.
Where am I going with this, Shaun? Where am I going with this?
I don't know. I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued that you're revealing all these sort of musical this musical side to yourself here.
But yes, I think to weave it back to English language teaching, I remember thinking about this because someone once said to me that they considered there's a Macmillan activity book called 700 Classroom Activities, and they considered that to be a classic. And I remember kind of sputtering, saying, that is not a classic. I mean, it's a great activity book, but not a classic. I mean, that's only, and it's probably now, 15 years old or something like that. So maybe for that teacher, it was, if it was the first book that they had their hands on and what really influenced them.
Yeah, I think again it goes back. Yeah, that's true. It goes back to what really influenced them, or what, is it an age thing? I remember. I know one of the books you were going to come up to is an L.G. Alexander book, but I remember in my first job in 1991 in the library had some L.G. Alexander books from about 1967. They were on skills or something into practice, was, if I remember rightly. And I remember back then thinking, just going back to your musical anecdote there, I think, yes, that's a classic because that's like before I was born. And
yeah, and I think definitely L.G. Alexander, who wrote many like grammar books, kind of course books, exercise books and stuff like that. I think lots of his stuff would be considered classic. I think of First Things First, but I'm sure other teachers would mention other books. Partly because I think another thing that makes something a classic is also like how widely available it became or widely known within the profession. And I would definitely say that probably in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, almost any language, many language classrooms would have had one of his books in there.
True. Yeah, no? Well, hence the fact, I guess, because I'm started teaching, obviously, just as the decade changed, the fact it still existed in that staff room, I guess. But yeah, okay. So books is hard. What about activities? Do we have other classic?
Okay.
Classic
well,
activities?
I want to come. Let's come back. I want to come back to books because I want to know what you think your classics are.
Yeah.
We're relating to your teaching career, and I'll tell you mine. But we can do activities now if you want. Shall we do a bit of activities then?
Well, I think activity we might agree easier on activities.
Yeah, I think we might agree. Okay, so you say one, I say one. So you start. What would you say is a classic ELT activity that if you saw that in a classroom, or if you said, I'm going to do this today, someone would say, yes, that's a classic.
Find someone who.
Totally. I totally agree. I would almost say that is probably, I mean, there's a few, but I would say that's got to be right up there as like a number one classic.
Is it defined then? Is it defined by the fact that if we say, you said you gave that really handy, like the Richards and Rogers definition, if they know, we all know Richards and Rogers by the name. So is it with an activity, if we say find someone who, is it because in our mind we all know how it works without even having to think about how it works?
You mean like we all have the schema of like exactly,
yeah,
we know, like
find someone who
find someone who or an FSW, yeah?
Yeah, you don't need to explain it unless you're a completely new teacher, because it's an activity usually done on day one on a CELTA course, isn't it? But
that's true. And it's always one as a teacher trainer that you do to illustrate a sort of like how everybody can be talking together with a task and everyone has to talk to everyone else. Yeah, I guess that would make that would tie into our definition of a classic. Okay, so that was your first one. Let me give you another one that I think is a classic. Again, this is day one on a teacher training course, and also day one for like novice teachers with a new class. They may have different names, but throwing a ball or other kind of plush objects around and saying your name and something about you.
I'm sure you're obsessed with that one because it's come up in so many episodes of the
Oh, it has. It's like, see, this is like classics that can be not good, you know? It always, I mean, classics in that sense, it reminds me of, was it Mick Jagger? Wasn't there a quote about Mick Jagger in his 30s saying, if at 73 years old, I'm still singing Satisfaction, I'm going to kill myself. Well, and he still is. Yeah. And I kind of think, you know, I think after a certain while, I'd be like, if at 65 years old or 70 years old, I'm still throwing a ball around and asking people's names, I'm going to kill myself.
I don't think it's one of the, I mean, I haven't done it for a very long time.
I don't think I do it anymore. I don't do it anymore, but I consider it a classic.
I haven't done a beginner teacher training course for a while, but yeah, I wonder if I would bring it out on day one. But it's such a passionless activity. Here, throw. What's your name? Catch.
I know. I know. And there's always some jerk who throws it too hard at somebody else, and you're always like oh just be careful, and your class has already started off on the bad foot. I don't know, that maybe I just have that.
Oh, okay, maybe yeah, no I won't go down that route.
The ball toss for names, I'd say, is a classic. Give me another one.
Well, I'm gonna say, because I really despise it, bingo.
Oh, I wouldn't have called that a classic one, but I guess you're right.
Really? I know. I'm adding it now because it wasn't on the list that I know you're looking at. I'd add it under the definition that if I say what bingo is, people will know what it is without having to think about the activity, think about the instructions, etc.
Yeah,
but I think it's a classic. I think it's a classic in the sense of like a vocabulary vision or something.
I suppose. Yeah, I don't usually go there in terms of vocabulary version classics as much as another one that's not on our list, but since we're going off list, I'd say like the back to the board or the hot seat or whatever you call it.
Hot seat, yeah.
You know, where one person is sitting in front of the class and you write some words on the board and the others have to make them, like, they have to define them and they have to make the person guess. That's where I always go as a classic one. Okay, let me give you another classic activity from the list then that I have. This is another one equally cringe-making for me now. The Post-it notes, like Who Am I, where you have Post-it notes on your forehead.
On your forehead? Oh, no, on the back.
Oh, on the back. You put it on the back. Oh, wait. Is this a North American and British thing? Are British teachers like too nervous to do that? Is that too up in your space to get it on your forehead?
I don't know. I guess it's how you learn it, isn't it? I mean, I've always I've played it at many a party with it on my head, but I mean, in the classroom, it's always been on the back. I don't know why.
I guess it's less intrusive, isn't it? You put it on the forehead. I still remember, though. I'm going to share a story of the first time I did this activity with some learners in Canada. I was teaching, it's a class for new Canadians, they're called. So these are recent, like, immigrants, refugees. And there was a guy from Korea and another guy from, I want to say Vietnam, but I can't remember. And the guy from Korea, like they were both older men. And we were playing this game with the Post-it notes. And the Vietnamese guy had on his head duck. Duck, you know, that was the animal. He had to guess that he was a duck, but his memory was failing, and so he, like, you know, you ask lots of questions, and halfway through he'd forget the questions that he asked, and he'd be asking the same questions again. And as a novice teacher, I was still stuck in that thing, like, until everyone has guessed correctly, we don't finish.
we're not like, finishing this game.
We're not, like, I wasn't reading the room, you know, and everyone's getting, like, people are getting more and more frustrated. You know, this was before we had cell phones, because otherwise they'd been checking their cell phones for sure. But they were saying there were a couple of Argentinians as well in the class. It was only like 5 or 6 of us.
I can imagine their deep sighs.
Deep sighs, and everyone's like this. And so finally the Korean guy, like, he's asked these questions, and we're always waiting for him to make his question, and it was like really labored and painful. And finally the Korean guy gets really frustrated at this Vietnamese old guy, and he says, okay, people eat in your country, people eat it, and it's very expensive. And the Vietnamese guy, suddenly his eyes light up. He goes, I am dog. And the Argentinians start screaming, oh no, God. And it just all went downhill from there.
Yeah, that story was almost as the stickers on the back or on the head there.
I know. See, I still haven't learned. I still drag things out.
I know, drag things out as long as you can.
All right, give me one more classic activity before we take a break.
I'm just wondering if it's that activity, or is it a technique? Because I'm going to go for dictation, because I feel that's classic. I feel that's one of the things in this case that people say, "Oh, we're modern now; we don't do dictation."
Yeah.
But I quite like it. I quite like dictation.
Okay, I would agree that dictation is classic in the negative sense of the word classic as well. But negative and positive. So negative for some, but then some people would reclaim it as positive. But do you think
I love
that's
dictation.
classic ELT, English language teaching? Because I would think that the running dictation is the classic ELT.
Running dictation. Are we doing a Room 101 episode? Oh,
I know. See how many of the classic things you don't like.
That put into Room 101. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's change from dictation. I'll come back to running dictation in a moment. But okay, drilling then, because I think drilling is a classic technique. I'm testing the boundaries. Maybe our audience can help us with what we mean by classic. But I'd say the classic is the drilling is often overlooked because it's kind of old technique, but it's a classic thing to do and a very good thing to do, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yep. I would definitely agree. So let's review which ones we agree are classics. And we'd say we both agree that dictation could be considered classic technique. Yeah. Find someone who is a classic activity.
Yeah, that's definitely classic.
Ball toss.
Yeah, I was thinking of, while you were telling your story of your career, I was thinking of combining ball toss with duck on your head. That'd be quite a good way of teaching him duck, wouldn't it? Sorry.
Okay, let's take a break, shall we?
Yes, why not? I tell you what, since we're talking classic, let's bring back a classic segment that we haven't done for a few seasons.
Okay.
It does mean getting James on microphone, though.
All right. What segment are we talking about? A classic segment.
A classic segment. Did you not listen to the birthday episode where we talked about how we'd forgotten about it? Anyway, without further ado, see if you remember this, Lindsay. Here's Jargon Buster.
Ooh.
Silence. Now that's a strange topic for an audio-only medium. The 20th century novelist, poet, playwright and psychiatrist Paul Goodman identified 8 different types of silence. There's the dumb silence of slumber or apathy, the sober silence that comes with a solemn face, the fertile silence of awareness, the alive silence of alert perception, the silence of listening to another speak, the noisy silence of resentment and self-recrimination, the baffled silence, and the silence of peaceful accord with other persons, or my favourite, communion with the cosmos. So, silence is more complicated than you think, and especially for us teachers, because it's a thing that seems to make us feel uncomfortable, especially towards the beginning of our careers, which explains the importance of the acronym we will be looking at in today's Jargon Buster, an acronym that every one of us would have heard at some point, especially in our initial teacher training courses, and undoubtedly it's a classic of ELT. That acronym is of course TTT. On the off chance that you've never heard of it, well, TTT stands for Teacher Talking Time, which, unlike many ELT acronyms, is pretty self-explanatory. Open any of the classic books of teacher training and you are guaranteed to find TTT in there somewhere. In How to Teach English, Harmer puts it right up at page 4, making sure that it is one of the essential takeaways from the book. In Learning Teaching, Scrivener mentions it 8 times and goes back to it throughout the book. Harmer, again, in The Practice of English Language Teaching, contrasts it with STT, Student Talking Time, describing how the concern is to maximise STT. And this is reinforced by Scrivener again in Classroom Management Techniques with a whole unit on reducing unnecessary teacher talk. So the message here seems loud and clear. Teachers talk too much and students don't talk enough. And while this may be true, I think it's worth considering what kind of talking is going on. Maybe the teacher engages one student in spontaneous conversation or leads a group discussion. Maybe they offer hot correction during a productive activity or answer a student's question on language or on culture or on something completely irrelevant to the objectives of the lesson. Maybe the teacher explains a grammar point or how vocabulary is actually used in the real world. All these exchanges are potentially worthwhile in a lesson, and equally there are times when they are inappropriate. There are times when a teacher spending a few minutes to make sure that his or her students really understand what is going on is very valuable. But if he or she doesn't know when to stop and continues rambling on for too long, it becomes a problem. Equally, we want our students to produce as much as possible, but if they overproduce and don't allow other students a chance, and we've all had those students, we'll have to step in and do something about it. All of these inputs and outputs need to be assessed in the same light. Are they justified? Is this the right time for this to be happening? And if yes, for how long? If no, what should I be doing instead? So when it comes to the often oversimplified matter of TTT, I'll leave the last word to Hugh Deller, who wrote, "I now find myself believing that actually, far from being something best avoided, TTT is really at the heart of good teaching. I also believe that if we are serious about improving the quality and quantity of our students talking, then TTT has a central role to play." Now, this being the wonderful world of ELT, naturally TTT has another meaning: test, teach, test. But that will have to wait for another time. Until then, this has been your Jargon Buster.
We started off by talking about classics, and we went first to books, didn't we? And then we kind of took a detour where we looked at what we thought were classic activities. I want to come back to books, and I want, like, I guess I wanted you to tell me what you think are the classic books in your mind, like off the top of your head. And again, I want to draw a distinction between classic books and like desert island books, because you might take like some books to. We had our desert island feature on this podcast where we asked people what they would take to an island. But I think classic books aren't exactly the same as that, although you may do that. But there are ones that you consider to be sort of everyone should know them. And so we talked, for example, about L.G. Alexander and Richards and Rogers. What other ones do you think are classics for you in your teaching career?
In my teaching career, well, I mean, again, it depends on, I think, on the type of book. I mean, I'll tell you what, I'll give you three. I'll give you three from different categories. I would say, and this is where I duck, that Headway is a classic, for example.
Yeah.
In the sense of it's a course book I used way back in the 1990s, still using it. It's just a classic book. When you say, if you take your Richards and Rogers argument, if you say Headway, people understand what that book is and what it is. I think it's classic in that sense.
Do you think that people are changing on that? Because do you think as it's been around so long, are there people that might not know? Like, I'm thinking younger teachers now are more familiar, for example, with English file, let's
possibly.
say.
But what I found with many teachers is that especially if they learnt English, so if they're a non-native English teacher, they actually learn their English from Headway, and now they're teaching from Headway. So I don't know I think the English teachers know it from a different way. Yeah, and I'm gonna say they are, but I still think it's still clearly a best-selling book, and it's still they're still making new editions of it. So there must be it must be used by quite a lot. So I know it's difficult. I mean, because now we're in course books. To go through the, you said at the beginning at the beginning of the episode, we're talking about ones that kind of they're influenced by my teaching. I think if I'd started teaching, let's say 5-6 years earlier, then
Yeah.
I might have been talking about
Streamline.
Streamline or Swan's English, Cambridge
Yeah.
English course, because they are from that era of when you started
Classics,
teaching.
yeah.
So for me, and I've used the Cambridge book and I've used Streamline, and I think your age definitely defines it. But Headway for me is one there, so I'll pick that one.
Okay. Give us two others.
I'm gonna go again because of so certainly the way I started teaching. I would say that Swan's Practical English Usage is a classic.
Yeah. Okay. I agree. Concur.
And I'm going to go a bit left field in the sense that I spend more time interacting with methodology books these days than most other things. I'm going to go for Lightbaum and Spader's How Languages Are Learned, but it's also my Desert Island book, so it's a bit of a trick. But that's 1996 first edition, so it's time to bend itself down. But again, it's one of those books. Is have you read Lightbaum and Spader, and you know what the book is. So
that's true. Yes, it's referred to by the author's names, Lightbound and Spada. And although lots of the people on courses that I do the training with, they call it light brown. It's always misquoted as light brown.
I thought it was. I've had the pleasure of meeting Patsy on a number of occasions now, and I thought her name was Light Brown originally. But there is one I've left off. There's another one I would say, but I think it's on your list, which is why I didn't choose it.
Okay.
People are shouting at me. Why did I choose this? Because I might have chosen some of these.
I'm going to choose three as well, which are classics for me, but I think for many teachers as well. Okay, so I'm going to go. The first one is going to be Penny Ehr's Grammar Practice Activities. Now, there's also, she did one called 5-Minute Activities, which I also think is a classic that like many teachers had and referred to. I think Grammar Practice Activities is more so because it's a methodology book with kind of generic activity descriptions for all the grammar points. And I remember at the time thinking it was such a lifesaver. You just look up and there'd be an example of an activity according to the grammar point you want to teach. So that would be one. My second one is another grammar one, and it is again a kind of activity book. I don't know why my mind went to activity books, although I completely think you're right about the methodology ones. And this was Grammar Games by Mario and Vellucri.
Yeah, no, I agree. That has to be there. Yeah.
I think that is an absolute classic in the sense there's so many, I was looking through it again today and I was thinking, oh my gosh, that activity, which I hadn't done in years, but it just feels like such a classic. I think there are dictaglosses in there, and there are the grammar dominoes and the grammar snakes and ladders. And
it's also. I think that's the book that taught me about deleting the words off the. You put the sentence on the board and you delete.
Yeah.
I think,
yeah.
No, I'd agree there.
I think I can even remember I'm not looking at it. I promise I'm not looking at it, but I think I can even remember it was like a poem. It's something like, "Darling, I love you so much. I fear if you do not love me, I may kill myself," or something like that. And you started deleting words until it made new texts. Oh, it was wonderful. Marienbad, I think it's called, that one. Anyway.
Sorry, I took you off track again, didn't I? We were reminiscing a little bit. Grammar Games, so Grammar Games, Penny Ehr's book. 3 was...
Oh, and the last one, which I do think it meets our criteria that we just arbitrarily stated at the beginning of the podcast, and I would say that is another book that is not referred to by its title, but either by its color or by its author's name. And I'd say it's
Red Murphy. You got a copy of Red Murphy? Have you got a copy of Blue Murphy?
Yeah, Red Murphy or Blue Murphy. Yeah, Red Murphy or Blue Murphy. And I think there's an Atlantic divide on this, because we asked on our Facebook page for people to talk about classics, and the first people that answered, I think, were North Americans, because the equivalent of the Murphy for many North Americans was a blue book and a red book as well, depending on the level, by an author called Betty Azar. And so they would just call it, I think, did they call it a Betty Azar? Do you have Azar or do you have Betty Azar?
I don't know. I don't know. We'll have to check back in with them. I've seen a copy of the book, but yeah, teaching British English is never used as much.
But it's the same. It's the same kind of thing. Like it's a grammar rules and exercises book intended for students for self-study, but often used by teachers. For many teachers, it's where they kind of they get their grammar knowledge from. Or some teachers use it as like a time filler in class, or like for homework, or as a consolidation. I mean, it's got so many
I would
uses.
definitely. Yeah, I knew you were going to say it, but otherwise I would have definitely had that as one of my three for sure.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely think so. I remember hearing, this is like second or third hand, someone saying that they saw Raymond Murphy give a talk where he said, and again, this is a proof that the book is a classic, how many iterations and editions it's been through. He said, "I am not a writer, I am a rewriter." Which is... So it's like the same book just being done over and over again. A bit like our Mick Jagger and Satisfaction thing. So if I am still writing present simple adverbs of frequency activities at 75, I ...
Lindsay, before we get into it, I suggest we just give the audience a little break.
Why don't we do that?
Hello, producer James here with a quick message to say thank you for listening to this, the 7th season of the TEFL Commute podcast. If you're interested in sponsoring this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. It's easy, just get in touch with us at our email address, teflcommute@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, back to the show.
Right then, come on then. You're going to take me through what make...
This was from a collection of essay on classical literature. The Italian writer Italo Calvino gave 14 criteria for what makes a classic. And I'm about to ask Shaun, I'm going to read not all of these, but some of these criteria. And as a thought experiment, we're going to apply them to Raymond Murphy's English Grammar in Use, or Essential Grammar in Use, and then decide, does that make it a classic? Okay?
Right, I'm ready.
Okay, number one, the classics are those books about which you usually hear people saying, I'm rereading. Never, I'm reading.
Well, I mean, is Murphy a book you read from cover to cover?
No, but no one says, they're always like, I'm going back into Murphy to check.
Yeah, as I say, I'm going back to, I'm re-referring.
I guess you'd say that, right? Going back to Murphy. You never go there. You're going back there.
I would say yes, as long as we change, as long as we don't have to go by reading. If we modify the part of it, you would
recheck.
revisit.
I'll just recheck that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. We can disagree with some of these criteria. Some we may disagree with. Here's another one. Does this apply to English grammar in use? The classics are those books which constitute a treasured experience for those who have read and loved them, but they remain just as rich an experience for those who reserve the chance to read them when they are in the best condition to enjoy them.
I'm going to disagree with that in terms of Murphy.
Do you think? Yeah. Does anyone have a treasured experience with Murphy? Maybe they do.
No. I think this is. I'm maybe speaking. As a naive beginning teacher, Murphy served my life on more than one occasion.
So maybe it does become a treasured experience for those who read and loved it. Yes, maybe.
But as a teacher trainer, no offense to the book, but as a teacher trainer, and I got so sick of watching people dish out an exercise from Murphy without realizing what I did deliver. So it was definitely not treasured, and I became to hate the experience of seeing Murphy in use. So for me, no.
All right. Okay. How about this one? A classic is a book which, even when we read it for the first time, gives the sense of rereading something we have read before.
Well, that case, yes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it just looks so familiar. You kind of think, yeah, I've seen this before. I've read this before. Okay. Oh, this one I think probably could apply. Definitely. Listen to this. A classic is a work which constantly generates a cloud of critical discourse around it, but which always shakes the particles off.
Yes, that's very true.
But no, because Murphy does always generate, especially in teacher training, it's just doing Murphy-like. I don't want to teach grammar in just a Murphy-like way. Yeah. But it just keeps going. Yeah. All right. Your classic is a book to which you cannot remain indifferent, and which helps you define yourself in relation or even in opposition to it.
I think I will refer you back to a statement I made probably about a minute ago, which will prove that is right.
Exactly. I kind of, it's almost like I'd set you up for that one, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, but you're right. Yes.
A classic is a work which persists as a background noise, even when a present that is totally incompatible with it holds sway.
Well, again, that's very true.
Yes, I think it's very interesting that despite, changes in methodology since the first, I don't even know when the first Grammar in Use came out, but I presume it came out before like task-based, dogme, and maybe some other more less grammar, less deductively grammar-led methods became in vogue. It still remains, even though it kind of survives that and keeps going.
It does. It really does. It really does. Does a modern classic also have a Wikipedia page? Because I was just looking to see when it was first published. First published in 1985. But it's got its own wiki page. You can't say that about many ELT books, can you? So
no, that's definitely true.
There you go.
Well, okay, Shaun.
I'd love to know if the audience agree with any of what we've put on our list for this episode.
And if you do want to comment, here's where you can find us. We are on Facebook at the TEFL Commute. We're also on Twitter, TEFL Commute, at TEFL Commute. And you can find us at our website, which is www.teflcommute.com.
He put in the 3 Ws.
I know, or just teflcommute.com. I think we're coming to the end of an episode, but not just the end of an episode. It's the end of our season. It is
the end of our season. I just, as we wrap up, remind people that we are also now on Spotify, so people don't even have to subscribe through through iTunes anymore. They could just find us on Spotify as well.
That's right. Yeah.
The addition of season 7 to Spotify. That was our happy news of the end of another season. Just go fast, doesn't it, Lindsay?
I know it does. It does. Well, we will be back again at the beginning of the school year, beginning in September. If your school year begins in September, around September or October is when we usually kick off another season. In the meantime, we'd like to wish all of you listeners the best summer or winter, depending what hemisphere you're in. Happy teaching, happy intensive courses if that's what you're doing, teacher training, or just holidays, right, Shaun?
It's quite a long list, isn't it? It's
not for you,
not for you or you, because we go into our busy period of life. Of teacher training.
Exactly.
But I look forward to dueling with you on a microphone again in the autumn, Lindsay.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Enjoy your summers or winters. Bye.
As your commute is coming to an end, here's an activity you can take into class. In this episode, Lindsay asked Shaun to consider what makes something a classic using questions by Italian writer Italo Calvino. You could ask your students to do the same thing. Firstly, ask them to make a list of films, books, TV shows, or video games that they consider classics. Then give them Calvino's criteria to judge their choices. The students could then present their classics to the class, and they can vote on if they agree or not. You can find the instructions for this and our other end of pod activities at our website, teflcommute.com. You've been listening to the TEFL Commute, an original podcast produced and presented by Lindsay Clanfield, Shaun Wilden and James Taylor. Don't miss out on any episodes by subscribing to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or your podcast player of choice, and by visiting us at teflcommute.com.